Okay, we're going to turn to a piece you wrote in ProPublica, and I'm going to read it here. As Trump calls for law and order, can Chicago's top prosecutor beat the charge that she's soft on crime? And this goes to my earlier question. There's the anti-reform movement, and this goes to CWB Chicago and Chicago City Wire, Second City Cop Blog, and the other of that ilk. They love exposing any single bad incident, right? So if someone that got out on bond reform that committed a crime again while he or she was waiting, I feel to some degree the media hasn't pushed back hard enough on the fact we seem to have gotten lost. What's gotten lost in the discussion is, what is bail for, right? What is it for, right? Like, we have it's a system that was basically created to make sure people show up for court, right?
Right.
And rare occasion of when someone is an obvious imminent threat, then maybe they shouldn't get bail. The bail would be so high that they can't bail themselves out because they're an imminent threat to the life and safety of people, and certain people that you can document that. But to some degree, I feel like all this reform and the anti-reform movement, what's gotten lost is this discussion of what bail is for.
I think there are so many things caught up in this one discussion. And the point of my piece, as I was saying to you before we officially started taping, my point of the piece was looking at this climate of law and order that President Trump, among others, has clamored for. In a democratic city, you don't hear people using that same language, but you hear other coded language, which amounts to the same thing. And around here, it is my argument that Kim Foxx has basically become a convenient symbol for a lot of politicians, Republican and Democrat, who use her to basically play off people's fears of crime, and they use Kim Foxx as their victim. They basically say she's the one to blame. They blame her. So blaming Kim Foxx for crime, blaming Kim Foxx for letting people out of jail in Chicago is the equivalent of Donald Trump calling for law and order during his re-election campaign. And, Chicago, everything not so far below the surface, Tracy, is racial in Chicago. And I'm only exaggerating slightly when I say everything. But here the optics are obvious. Kim Foxx, an African-American woman who has, as we've been discussing, campaigned 4 years ago as a reformer. And not that her record is above reproach. You and I just got done criticizing her, but she has followed through on a lot of things she promised to do during her campaign 4 years ago. I think, will you like her or not, you have to acknowledge that she said she was going to do a lot of the things she has done. However, the criticism of her, the legitimate criticism of her, the discussion about are her policies good or bad, effective or otherwise, totally legitimate. But that's all mixed in with confusion about what her office does and doesn't do. And a lot of the confusion is purposely put out there by people who are just using her for their own political benefit. So that brings us up to the whole issue of bail and bond. People go to prison if they're sentenced to prison during, at the conclusion of a trial. They're found guilty or they plead guilty. A judge, a jury sentences them to serve time in prison. Jail is where people sit if they are deemed to be a threat to the public before they go on trial. And so the notion that Cook County Jail should just be full of people who are suspected of going on, that Cook County Jail is the way that where everybody goes once they're arrested for a crime is false. That is a complicated decision-making process. A judge ultimately decides who is going to go to jail before their trial starts and who are we okay with letting out until their trial starts. And you said a few minutes ago, Tracy, you're right. Initially, this was based on several things. One is potential threat to the public. Okay, if there is evidence that someone should be charged with a homicide, I personally, sitting here, Mick Dumke in 2020, I don't know why they would be out on the street. If there's evidence that you think they should be, enough evidence to charge them with killing someone, in my opinion, they should be sitting in jail, and even before they go to trial. However, there's all sorts of other crimes that don't involve homicide. So where do you draw the line? And that's really what the issue is. If someone is caught shoplifting, should they be sitting in jail before they go on trial? They haven't been found guilty yet. Should they be sitting in jail? There's a lot of people who say Kim Foxx is responsible for letting all kinds of shoplifters off the hook. They should all be in jail. As a result, she's responsible for the looting that's happened in Chicago. To me, those are several huge logical leaps, but that's part of the argument that's going on out there. So people don't understand the bail and bond system. They also don't understand electronic monitoring, which is often similar or different. There are some people who can be put on an electronic ankle, what they call an ankle bracelet. You go free pending trial. Some people can even be sentenced on an electronic bracelet. Instead of sitting behind bars to serve out a sentence, you could be at home on electronic monitoring. Kim Foxx prosecutors, they can recommend whether someone has bail or bond or even goes on electronic monitoring. They do not make that decision. So you can not like Kim Foxx, you can criticize her policies, but she is not the one who decides, and neither are her employees, the ones who decide whether someone is free on bail pending trial. That's not their job, but yet she's blamed for all of it.
Right. And part of this is we just don't have access to the data, like the raw data from the courts. Like there's historical context to this. You can't just say, well, this guy got out. I mean, there have been guys that have been arrested on gun possession for time and a memorial in Chicago who judges have let out on little bail or no bail, I-bonds, forever. This is nothing new. It's new, I think, partially because there's a Black prosecutor, partially because she's supposedly progressive, and her enemies and political enemies are coming at her hard. And I think there's some scapegoating going on by our mayor and our police superintendent. I think they tried to make the connection to the people that originally were arrested as part of the protests and part of the looting that happened. And that somehow her failure to keep these people inside and keep them and get them convicted in the short period of time is why we had repeats of the looting. And they of all people know that's untrue. So that to me is a big problem. This isn't some political operation that's faking journalism and leveling horrific, untrue allegations that they may not even be smart enough to know are untrue, right? But Mayor Lightfoot and Brown both know a lot of their allegations are just flat out untrue.
Absolutely. And they're joined by members of the city council. They're joined by other political figures, and other people have just repeated these untruths. And I think it is fear-mongering based in race. Another thing that's very important and difficult for us to acknowledge, but it's very important. Look, most people who get locked up are coming out. There are very few people who are sentenced to life. Those are like the most egregious murder cases. You know, everybody else, for the most part, is coming out at some point in time. The question is, how long should they serve? And what is the point of their time being locked up if they are locked up? Is this a punitive measure, or are we trying to rehabilitate people? These get into much broader questions, but when they're sitting in jail, I think that, and again, I'm not weighing in on one specific policy or another. I'm just saying, first of all, let's clear up who's actually responsible for what.
Yep.
Judge Evans, who's the chief judge, I remember having him and interviewing him several years ago, when at that point in time, judges hardly let anybody out on bail or bond. They posted very high bonds. And so I literally sat in bond court one day and watched a guy who was obviously not all there, probably homeless or semi-homeless. And he had been sitting in jail already for a couple of days by that point, and he was going back to jail after shoplifting a pair of socks. Okay? He was a repeat shoplifter, so it wasn't just the first time he'd done this, but this was the decisive event that was keeping him locked up. There was nothing good done for the public by him being locked up. I guess if you're the merchant whose socks got stolen, you could say, well, there was something good done for them because he didn't go back and steal more socks. But it didn't solve the problem fundamentally in any way. There were so many cases like this, Tracy, at that time. judges then were very reluctant of, as Judge Evans said to me quite candidly, the Willie Horton case. There's
Yep.
always going to be a case, judges let somebody out too soon, the media is going to jump on it, and this anecdote, however horrible it may be, people may have been hurt as a result of it, but you're going to use this as the anecdote for the whole. You're going to use this instead of analysis of what's actually going on. So they were, in the last 5 or 6 years, things have started to swing the other way, where judges took so many hits for locking up people who didn't necessarily need to be there and needed other kinds of help, instead of just sitting in jail. Then now they started to go the other way, and now we're seeing all this barrage of criticism. They're letting too many people out. I have yet to see a really good study of what's going on, like you're talking about. You almost need to do a longitudinal study. The stuff I've seen is for 6 months, 9 months, a year. That's too small of a sample size. Or it's even shorter, where you have the police department feeding anecdotal stuff to various reporters and saying, we found 20 cases of people who committed crimes when they were out on bond. And it's like, well, how many cases did you look at that time? There were thousands, and you found 20? Actually, I would argue that's successful.
Right.
I
You
mean,
have no right. Nationwide,
what I mean?
Statistically, that's a great number. Reoffending rates like 70% out of prison.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's
what
and
is
listen,
what
I
is
say that,
2%?
It's horrible for anyone who's been a victim of any kind
Correct.
of crime. I'm certainly not saying it's okay for people to be victims of crime. It's horrible. We need to do everything we can to stop them. But let's be realistic. You simply cannot lock up everybody for everything. You can't. You don't have the resources for it, and it doesn't solve problems.